43 years of getting up before the sun, and the only thing I ever wanted, on the other side of it, was a piece of land that was mine. Not a vacation property, not an investment. A place where I could walk out the back door in the morning with a cup of coffee and hear absolutely nothing except whatever the woods decided to say. I'd had that vision in my head since I was 32 years old. Standing in a parking garage in Cleveland at 6:15 on a February morning, scraping ice off my windshield while the wind came off Lake Erie, like it had a personal grievance with me. That morning I made myself a promise. Someday, I told myself, I will have a porch and a tree line and no parking garage within 50 miles. It took me 21 more years to get there. My name is Kevin. I spent 4 decades in industrial logistics. Not glamorous, not the kind of thing anyone asks you about at parties, but the kind of work that keeps everything else moving. I retired at 62 with a pension that wasn't extravagant, but was solid, a 401(k). I'd been careful with, and enough in savings to make one purchase that mattered. My wife Sandra and I bought 11 acres outside of Asheville, North Carolina. There was a farmhouse on it, built in 1948, that needed work but had good bones, and a back porch that looked out over a ridge of blue-gray mountains that made everything else feel smaller and quieter in the best possible way. We moved in on a Thursday in late September. Sandra made chili for dinner. We sat on that porch until 10 o'clock at night, watching the lights of the valley blink on one by one as the dark came in, and I thought, this is it. This is the whole point. For 11 months, it was everything I'd hoped for. And then my son-in-law called to tell me his family was moving in. He didn't ask. That's the part I want you to understand. He didn't call to request or propose or float the idea. He called to inform, welcome to Dad's silent revenge. Grab something warm, settle in, and remember, in every one of these stories, the person who thought they were making a smart move turns out to have made the worst one of their life. Subscribe so you never miss one. Our daughter Meredith had married Cliff 2 years earlier. I'd been cordial about it, because Meredith loved him. And Meredith's happiness has always mattered more to me than my own comfort. But I'd had my red on Cliff from the first Thanksgiving he spent with us. He was the kind of man who redirected every conversation back to himself without appearing to notice he was doing it. He had a habit of describing other people's choices as interesting, in a tone that made clear he found them unfortunate, and he laughed at his own jokes about 4 seconds before the punchline. As if he couldn't wait to get to the part where everyone acknowledged how clever he was. Sandra called him ambitious. I called him something that rhymes with it but starts differently. Meredith taught high school history. Cliff worked in residential real estate development. They lived in Charlotte, 2.5 hours east. We saw them maybe once a month. That felt like the right frequency for both parties. Cliff's parents, his father Gary and his mother Renata, I had met exactly 4 times. Gary was quiet, seemed decent enough, had spent 30 years as a city planner, before a series of health problems had complicated his retirement. Renata was the kind of woman who filled silences the way water fills a glass. Completely, immediately, and with no apparent awareness that there had been a shape to the container before she arrived. She had opinions about everything: interior design, property values, what other people should be doing with their square footage. I had mentally filed Gary and Renata under not my concern. That changed on a Tuesday evening in August when Cliff called me directly. Not Meredith. Cliff. Hey, Kevin. He had this way of opening conversations that made it sound like he was doing you a favor by dialing. I wanted to run something by you. I was on the back porch watching the sun drop behind the ridge. I should have let it go to voicemail. I did not know that yet. Gary and Renata, he said, are going through a transition. He said transition the way a real estate brochure says opportunity, like the word itself was doing him a favor. What kind of transition? I asked. Financial, mostly. They sold their house in Raleigh last year, you know that. The plan was to rent while they figured out their next move, but the market's been brutal, and Gary's medical costs have gone up more than they expected. He paused. They're not in a great spot. I said I was sorry to hear that. I meant it about Gary, so we were thinking. Cliff said, and I know this is a big ask, but you have the space out there, 3 bedrooms, and they just need somewhere stable while we sort this out. 3 months, maybe 4. just until we figure out the next step. The ridge had gone orange and purple by then. A pair of deer were standing at the edge of the tree line 50 yards out. Everything was very still. "Cliff," I said, "this is Sandra's and my home." "Absolutely, of course. We're not asking for anything permanent. Just temporary until they get their footing." I told him I'd talk to Sandra. He said, "Great," before I'd finished the sentence, and I noticed that. The way the word arrived too fast. Like the answer had already been filed away. I sat on the porch for another hour after I hung up. The deer went back into the trees. The lights came on in the valley. I thought about the parking garage in Cleveland, about the 21 years, about the chili Sandra had made on our first night, about how peace, once you've worked hard enough for it, becomes something you recognize immediately when someone starts sizing it up. The next 2 weeks were a campaign. Cliff texted. Meredith called. Renata, who had never once called me or Sandra in 2 years of being extended family, sent an email that was 6 paragraphs long and used the phrase, "We're just trying to land on our feet," no fewer than 4 times. Gary sent a voicemail. He sounded embarrassed. I felt for him. Sandra is a generous woman. I watched her soften the way I'd known she would. She started saying things like it's only a few months, and they're struggling, and we have the room. I listened, I nodded, I did not commit. Here's the thing about Cliff's approach that I want to name clearly, because I've thought about it a lot since. He was counting on something specific. He wasn't counting on my generosity. Exactly. He was counting on the calculation most people make when they're asked to help family. The calculation that says, yes is easier than no, that no requires justification and yes doesn't, that saying no to someone in need makes you the villain by default. He was counting on the path of least resistance, and he'd correctly identified that Sandra would help smooth it. What he hadn't correctly identified was me. On the Thursday of the second week, Cliff came out alone. No Meredith. He drove 2.5 hours on a weekday afternoon, which told me everything about how important this was to him. We sat at the kitchen table. He had his businessman posture, back straight, hands folded, like he was presenting to a zoning board. "I get the sense there's some hesitation on your end," he said. "Your instincts are sound," I said. He didn't flinch. "Kevin, I just want to be honest with you. This situation is creating real stress in our household. For Meredith, and honestly, when Meredith is stressed, it puts strain on our marriage. That affects everything." He let that sit there, including the kids. They had 2. Emmett was 6, Hazel was 4. Good kids, not a factor in his parents' housing situation, but Cliff had just made them one. I looked at him for a moment. "Let me talk to Sandra," I said. He drove home satisfied. I watched his car until it disappeared around the bend in the driveway. Then I called my old colleague Pete. We'd worked together for 18 years. Pete had gone into property security consulting after we both left the company, and he knew more about home monitoring systems than anyone I'd ever met. "Pete," I said, "I need cameras." "What kind of situation?" "The kind where I'm going to say yes to something and I want documentation of what happens after." There was a pause. Then Pete said, "How many rooms?" "All the ones that matter." He laughed. Pete had a laugh that said he'd heard enough of life not to be surprised by any of it. He came out 4 days later with a colleague. They installed 7 cameras total: front door, the main living area, kitchen, back porch, hallway, the entrance to the driveway, and one covering the storage room we used as a secondary office, which I'd already begun moving our important papers into, all connected to an encrypted cloud account, all legal under North Carolina's single-party consent law. I'd verified that before Pete arrived. I told Sandra I was saying yes to the arrangement. I told her about the cameras 2 days after Pete installed them. She looked at me with an expression I know well. It's the one that says she's deciding whether to argue or wait to see if I'm right. "You're expecting something to happen," she said. "I'm documenting our home," I said. She didn't argue. Sandra grew up with 3 older brothers. She has a better calibration for when a man's instincts are worth trusting than most people I know. We said yes. Cliff sent a text that was 3 lines long and somehow still felt like a press release. Gary and Renata arrived on a Friday with 2 SUVs worth of belongings. Gary shook my hand at the door, firm grip, eyes that looked directly at mine, quiet thank you. I meant it when I told him he was welcome. Renata walked in and said, "Oh, this is so cozy," in the specific tone that means smaller than expected. She touched everything in the entryway. The lamp, the coat hooks, the frame on the wall, with the photo of the mountain view Sandra had taken on our first morning. She tilted it slightly as if straightening it. It'd been perfectly straight. I said nothing. I noted the time on my phone. Within 36 hours, Renata had reorganized the kitchen cabinets. I want to be specific about this, because the specifics matter. I opened the cabinet above the coffee maker on Saturday morning and found that all the mugs had been moved to a different cabinet, the one that required reaching slightly higher and was less convenient to access when you're standing at the machine, and the space above the coffee maker had been filled with a set of decorative ceramic bowls that had been in her car and that I had never seen before. My coffee grinder, the Baratza Encore that I'd bought myself as a retirement gift and that I used every morning without exception, had been moved to the back of the counter behind the toaster. "Renata," I said when she appeared, "did you reorganize these cabinets?" "Oh, I hope you don't mind." I was trying to be helpful. The flow was just a little backwards. She smiled. "I have a gift for kitchen layouts. This is our kitchen," I said pleasantly. "Please don't move things without asking." Of course, of course. I just thought, "Please don't move things without asking," I said again. Same tone, same words. She apologized with the energy of someone who had already decided they hadn't done anything wrong. That afternoon, I put the mugs back. The next morning, they'd been moved again. I put them back a second time. I did not say anything else about it. The cameras were running. I was keeping records of everything in a private notes app. Date, time, what happened. Not because I was planning anything dramatic, because I've spent 40 years in logistics, and the one thing logistics teaches you is that documentation is the only thing that's true when memories start to differ. The second week was when I began to understand the actual scope of what was happening. I was at my workbench in the garage, Wednesday morning, when my phone buzzed. Motion alert from the kitchen camera. I opened the app. Renata was on the phone, leaning against the counter, speaking quietly in the way people speak when they're certain they're alone. I turned up the volume. Honestly, more space than they need at this point. 3 bedrooms and they only use 2. There's that whole room off the master they keep locked, but the rest of it. She paused, listening. "No, he's in the garage. Sandra took the car somewhere. It's just me." Another pause. "I'm just saying, Cliff, if this works out the way I think it can, there's no reason your father and I would ever need to look for another place. The man is retired. They travel. Half the time this house is just sitting here." I set the phone down on the workbench. I sat there for a while, looking at the grain of the wood I'd been sanding. A chickadee landed on the windowsill outside and looked in at me. Long term. No reason to look for another place. This house just sitting here. I sent Pete a text. "You're going to want to see what I'm collecting." He wrote back. "Save everything to the secondary backup." I was pleasant at dinner that evening. I asked Gary about his physical therapy appointments. I asked Renata if she'd found the hiking trails on the county trail map Sandra had left on the end table. I was so agreeable it probably should have alarmed someone. By the third week, the pattern was clear. Cliff came out on weekends more often than felt like a son-in-law visiting his parents. He and Renata had long conversations on the back porch that they treated as private. The porch camera disagreed. What I heard over several sessions was a picture assembled in pieces. Renata believed that Gary's health concerns made a permanent arrangement reasonable, even necessary. Cliff had apparently told her that Kevin and Sandra just need time to get used to the idea, and there was a detail I hadn't known. Cliff had mentioned to a colleague of his, someone named Drew, that the Asheville property was functionally available for long-term family use, a phrase that appeared in a voice memo Renata had on her phone and played back for Cliff on my back porch on a Saturday afternoon in September. The voice memo. On my back porch. I thought about what that phrase meant in Cliff's professional vocabulary. Functionally available for long-term family use. He described my home, which I had purchased, which I had dreamed about for 21 years, in the language of property acquisition. The conversation I had with Gary that week stays with me. He came down to the workbench one evening after dinner. He moved carefully because of his hip and his knee, both of which had been giving him trouble. He looked at what I was doing. I was restoring an old ladderback chair I'd found at an estate sale, and sat on a stool nearby without asking, which I found I didn't mind. We talked for a while about wood, about the difference between furniture that was built to last, and furniture that was built to look like it was. Then Gary said, "Kevin, I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "Did Cliff tell you that Sandra and you were open to this becoming permanent?" The workbench light made everything in the garage sharp and clean. "No," I said. "We were never open to that." Gary was quiet for a moment. I could hear the peepers starting up outside. "He told me you were," he said. "That you'd said as much to Meredith." "We hadn't." Another silence. Gary looked at the chair I was working on. "I'm going to tell you something. I love my son. He has gotten us into situations his whole life, and then handed them to someone else to manage. I've spent 30 years watching Renata manage the damage after the fact, because it was easier than stopping him at the start." He looked at the floor. "I'm sorry that this has landed on you. It was one of the more honest things anyone had said to me in a long time." "I appreciate that, Gary," I said. We sat there a while longer. The peepers got louder. I offered him a beer, and he accepted, and we didn't talk about Cliff or Renata or any of it again that night. What I didn't tell him was that the workbench camera was running. Week 5 was when the whole thing broke open. Sandra and I drove to Black Mountain on a Saturday afternoon to pick up an order from a woodworker I'd commissioned for a dining table. We were 40 minutes out when my phone lit up. Driveway camera. Motion. I opened the app. Cliff's car was pulling in. I opened the living room camera. Cliff was inside. Not with Gary. Not with Renata. He was alone in the main living area, and he was on his phone, and he was walking the perimeter of the room in the slow, deliberate way of someone calculating dimensions. Then Renata came in from the hallway. "If you open this wall here," Renata said, "you add at least 200 square feet of usable, Mom." That was Meredith's voice. I felt something cold and clarifying run through me at the sound of my daughter's voice. "This isn't our house. This is about family, honey." "That doesn't make it our house, Mom." "Cliff." "They're not home," Cliff said. "We're just looking." I handed Sandra my phone without a word. She looked at the screen. Her expression did something I hadn't seen it do in 34 years of marriage. It went very, very still. "Turn around," she said. We were home in 40 minutes. Cliff's car was still in the driveway. I pulled in beside it. I sat for a moment with the engine off. Sandra looked at me. She knows me well enough to know what quiet looks like on my face when it means something. "Kevin." "I'm all right," I said. I was not angry. I want to be precise about that. What I felt was something that had been accumulating for 5 weeks, and that had just finished forming itself into something clear and final and unmoving. It felt less like anger and more like concrete setting. We went inside. Meredith saw my face from across the room and went pale. Cliff turned from the far wall, where he'd been standing with Renata, and produced that professional smoothness that I'd clocked back at the first Thanksgiving. The lid that drops over everything, the recovery that's faster than the flinch. "Kevin," he said, "we were just thinking out loud about—" "Come and sit down," I said. We all sat. Gary had appeared in the doorway from the hallway. I didn't ask him to join us. He came anyway and took the chair by the window and folded his hands in his lap. "I have something to share," I said. I pulled out my phone. I pulled up the kitchen camera recording from week 2. Renata's voice filled the room. Clean audio. Excellent quality. "Thank you, Pete." Saying the words she'd believed only her son could hear. No reason to look for another place. Just sitting here. Functionally available. The room got very still. You've been recording us?" Cliff said. "I've been documenting my own home." The cameras are installed in accordance with North Carolina law, single-party consent, and they were installed before you arrived, which is relevant because the documentation begins before your first day here. That's an invasion of... "It's a cloud account," I said, "with backup storage. Everything is preserved." I looked at him steadily. "All of the porch conversations. The voice memo Renata played for you. The conversation where you told your mother that Sandra and I just needed time to come around." I paused. "And the recording from this afternoon." Cliff's professional lid slipped. Just for a moment, something genuine and unprepared came through. Meredith was looking at her husband with an expression I recognized from when she was 17 and had just done the math on something she didn't want to add up. Cliff, she said. Quiet. 2 syllables that carried about 40 pounds of weight. I kept going. I told them about the key. The spare key from the hook by the back door that had gone miss in week 3, and that I now knew Renata had taken without asking and given to Cliff. I told them what Gary had told me in the garage, that Cliff had told his father Sandra and I were open to a permanent arrangement. I told them about the voice memo with the phrase functionally available. And I played the recording from the living room that afternoon. Renata's voice talking about walls and square footage, and a house that wasn't hers to reconfigure. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Sandra was sitting next to me. She hadn't said a word. She didn't need to say anything. Sandra in silence is, in my experience, significantly more formidable than most people at full volume. Renata tried. Kevin, I think you're reading too much into what we're very casual. Renata, Sandra said. One word. Renata stopped. You sat in our kitchen, Sandra said, and described our home to your son as real estate. That isn't casual. That's a plan. Renata opened her mouth, then she closed it. You have 2 weeks, I said. I'll help Gary with logistics if he needs it. He can take as much time on that as he needs. But the arrangement ends in 2 weeks. Cliff tried the angle I'd been expecting. He pivoted to family cohesion, to the effect on Meredith and the kids, to how this would define our relationship going forward. He was good at it. He had a real estate developer's fluency, with reframing, with finding the version of events that cast him as the reasonable one. I'd watched him do it at dinner tables, and in the driveway, and on that very porch for 2 years. Cliff, I said when he finished, I have recordings of you on my porch describing my property with the vocabulary you use professionally. I have a voice memo in which the word permanent appears several times, and I have a recording from this afternoon of you measuring the sight lines of my living room while I was 40 minutes away. I paused. There isn't a frame that accounts for all of that except the correct one. Meredith stood up. She looked at her husband for a long moment, the kind of look that suggests a very long conversation is coming later, and then she walked over to me and put her hand on my shoulder and said, Dad, I'm sorry. Not your fault, I said. Some of it is, she said. I should have asked you more directly. I should have pushed back on Cliff before it got here. I put my hand over hers. We'll talk, I said. The following 2 weeks were not peaceful. Cliff called twice. He tried Sandra once, with the argument that my refusal to accommodate his parents permanently was a referendum on our family's relationship. Sandra, who, by this point, had listened to every recording including the ones from the porch, told him with a courtesy that barely covered the iron underneath it, that she'd already heard everything she needed to hear. Renata moved through the house with the energy of a woman who was aggressively not saying what she was thinking. She rearranged 2 things she knew I'd notice and then moved them back before I could say anything, as if testing whether I was watching. I was. I noted the timestamps. Gary asked me one evening if I'd meant what I said about helping with logistics. I told him yes. We spent an afternoon looking at senior communities outside Asheville. There were several good ones, and one in particular, with a woodworking shop in the activity center, that Gary lit up about, in a way I hadn't seen from him before. I drove him over to tour it the following Tuesday. He asked careful, intelligent questions. He shook hands with the coordinator on the way out. In the car on the way back, he said, I wish we'd looked at this 3 months ago. You might not have been ready 3 months ago, I said. He thought about that. No, he said. Probably not. Moving day was a Thursday. The sky was clear, and the mountains were doing what they do in October, when the light comes in at a low angle, and everything is too beautiful to fully take in at once. Gary came and found me in the garage before they loaded the last of it. He shook my hand and didn't let go right away. You're a fair man, he said. You're a decent one, I said. You deserved better management. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but related to one. Renata has ideas, he said. I noticed. Cliff has ideas too. I noticed that as well. He let go of my hand. He walked back to the cars. Renata passed me in the doorway without making eye contact. I noted that too. Not in the app, just in the way you note things you don't forget. Cliff came last. He stood at the edge of the driveway with his keys. I hope, he said, that we can move forward from this. I looked at him over the railing. Cliff, I said, you used Meredith's emotions as leverage to move your parents into our home. You described our property to a colleague using language that assumed access you didn't have. You had your mother take a key from our home, without asking, came here, uninvited, while we were away, and walked the measurements of a room you had no standing to modify, and then you expected me to feel like I was the obstacle. He didn't say anything. What I want you to understand, I said, is that everything I've described is saved in a format that doesn't expire. And if there's ever another attempt to reframe, redirect, or maneuver this family for your benefit, Meredith gets all of it. Not edited. All of it. He looked at me with an expression I found interesting. It wasn't anger. It was the expression of a man who has discovered, too late, that the person he'd read as the passive one had been paying attention the entire time. That the quiet guy with the mountain property and the woodworking hobby hadn't been slow or soft or easy to manage. He'd simply been patient. Are we clear? I said. He nodded once. Safe drive home, I said. They were gone by 11. Sandra came and sat next to me on the porch. She brought 2 cups of the good coffee, the Ethiopian Yirgacheffe I save for mornings that earn it. She poured without asking, because after 34 years, she knows exactly how I take it. We sat and watched the mountains. You know, Sandra said after a while, when you called Pete, I thought you were being excessive. I know. I was wrong. You were hoping for the best, I said. That's not wrong, it's just different from what I was doing. She looked at her cup. What were you doing? Paying attention, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed. The real laugh. Not the company one. The one that comes from somewhere involuntary and sounds like everything is going to be all right. Meredith came out 2 weeks later, alone. We hiked the ridge trail behind the house, the one that takes about 90 minutes if you don't rush, and we didn't rush. At the top, where you can see 3 counties and the mountains just go on, in every direction, she sat on a flat rock and didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, How did you know? From the beginning. I thought about the phone call that came in like a notification instead of a question. The smile that came before Sandra finished her sentence. The way Cliff had said, great, before I'd finished saying I'd think about it. He told me his parents were moving in, I said. Not asked. Told. She was quiet. The first sentence, I said. If you listen to the first sentence, you usually hear everything. She picked up a stone and turned it in her hand. I'm having conversations, she said. With Cliff. With a counselor. I don't know where it ends up, wherever it needs to, I said. She put her head briefly on my shoulder, the way she used to when she was 12, and something at school had gone sideways. Then she straightened up, because she's an adult, because she is stronger than she was at 12, because time does that to people who pay attention. Dad, she said. Yeah, thank you for not pretending it was fine. It wasn't fine, I said simply. We sat up there a while longer. The wind came over the ridge and the trees moved, and the mountains didn't. The last thing I heard about Cliff was through Meredith, who heard it from Gary, who calls her sometimes now, which is something I don't know the full meaning of yet, but which strikes me as decent. Cliff had taken on a new development project 2 counties over that was keeping him busy. Renata and Gary had settled into the community we'd toured. Gary had joined the woodworking shop. He'd made a small end table, Meredith said. He was proud of it. I don't spend time thinking about Cliff. I don't spend time thinking about Renata. I think about Gary sometimes, and I hope the table came out well. What I do think about, when I'm on the back porch at 6 in the morning, with the fog sitting in the valley and the mountains barely visible through it, is this. There is a specific kind of person who looks at a man who has worked hard and built something and stepped back to finally enjoy it and sees not a life, but an opportunity. They see someone who's passed the most aggressive years, who values peace over conflict, who will absorb rather than erupt. They see a soft target wearing the face of a quiet man. What they don't see, because quiet men don't advertise it, is that the stillness is not absence. It's storage. It's 40 years of reading rooms, managing problems, watching people reveal themselves under pressure. It's a camera in 7 locations, and a cloud backup, and a notes app with timestamps. Going back to the first morning the coffee mugs moved, it's the knowledge that if you are patient enough, people will show you exactly who they are. I go out every morning now at 6, coffee in hand, and I stand on the porch and I look at the mountains. Some mornings Meredith calls, and we talk for 20 minutes about nothing important. Some mornings Sandra comes out, and we don't talk at all. Last Saturday Emmett and Hazel came up with Meredith for the weekend, and Emmett helped me sand a bookshelf I'm building. And Hazel chased a toad across the yard for 45 minutes with the absolute certainty of a child who does not yet know that not everything can be caught. The mountains were the same as they always are. The house was quiet in the way I'd always meant for it to be. The mugs are where I put them.